Warner Brothers. Its subject is America after an electromagnetic pulse attack. Thank you again for being here.
It's a pleasure.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
I'm afraid that there are many people watching who perhaps don't know what an electromagnetic pulse attack is or would be. Maybe we start with your explaining that concept.
Sure. EMP is shorthand for electromagnetic pulse. It is a byproduct of any detonation of a nuclear weapon. First realized in some testing in the 60s. And before we go any further, I know this sounds like sci-fi. So you in the audience, folks watching this later, if this sounds like sci-fi, this evening go on the internet, Google up EMP, go to Wikipedia. Here's a couple other things you should look up. Starfish Prime, which was the American test in 1962 of detonating a weapon in space, which blew out a fair part of the power grid in Hawaii. Also look up Soviet test 184. And then finally, if you want to look at a completely different aspect of EMP, look up the Carrington event, which was triggered by a solar storm. Now to go back to answering your question, EMP, electromagnetic pulse, is a byproduct of detonating a nuclear weapon. Here's a scenario that's terrifying for me, and it's pointed out in the book in relationship to America. If you detonate a weapon approximately 200 to 250 miles above the center of the United States, and you don't need a high megaton range, a low kiloton range, like a little bit more than what the Koreans just detonated several weeks ago, will do it. The gamma ray burst, when it hits the upper atmosphere, starts a chain reaction. It's called the Compton effect. Imagine a pebble rolling downhill, finally triggering an avalanche. By the time this hits the Earth's surface at the speed of light, it is a giant electrostatic discharge. It feeds through the power grid of the United States. All of our wiring, antennas, everything become antennas picking up this electrical overload. It blows out the entire power grid of the United States. Game over.
So in other words, you've got a missile. Instead of hitting a target such as a city, a nuclear missile, and wiping out the city, you have the missile go high up above the United States, detonate the warhead there. People on the ground wouldn't feel a thing, probably, right?
No.
However, you would fry the electric grid, which means, and this becomes very clear in your book, which takes place in a town much like the one you live in, where you teach college, suddenly they find out that nothing electrical works. Every car on the highway pretty much has stopped. Anything that is computerized is dead. Phones don't work. Refrigeration doesn't work. Everything has stopped.
It's all gone.
It's all gone.
Scenarios, there's a variety of scenarios looking at this. Some people talk about a 3-weapon detonation, one on the East Coast, one in the center of the United States, one towards the West Coast. There's a number of various scenarios. Delivery by ICBM, or the really frightening one is a cargo ship just getting a couple hundred miles off the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. You do not need precision guidance when you're delivering an EMP weapon. We have to get out of Cold War thinking. All you have to do is do a general loft into the area, detonate it, and then the cascading effect starts. Now, the congressional studies done in 2004, 2008, one of the gentlemen testifying said that 90% of all Americans would be dead a year after an EMP event.
And I think you need to explain why they'd be dead. Obviously, it's not because of the force of the explosion. It's because of the absence of infrastructure. That means that food begins to rot, medicine begins to go bad, you can't deliver anything, there are no emergency vehicles, no planes are flying, no helicopters, all that's gone.
Let's talk about planes to start with. It's approximately noon, I think, as we're doing this program right now. At this moment, there's about maybe 250,000 Americans in transit, a couple thousand commercial planes. You can have Captain Sully up in the front seat, the famous pilot who saved all those lives by ditching the plane into the Hudson. Well, suppose he had lost his electrical along with his power. He'd be holding a stick that's useless. A fair number of commercial aircraft will fall in the first minute. It will make 9/11 pale to insignificance when compared to what will happen in the first minute.
In your novel, the president is in Air Force One when this happens, and Air Force One falls out of the sky.
Well, I always have to emphasize in all of these, I've only worked with unclassified information. So I can't speak directly as to what condition Air Force One is, but I pray that they have upgraded it from the last upgrade, which was some years ago.
Right.
By upgrading, I mean hardening.
Well, and I don't want to jump too far ahead, but let's just mention this and then we'll come back to it. If you are worried about the possibility of an EMP attack, there are two things that one should think about doing. And it seems to me, and I think it seems to you, and one is moving ahead rapidly towards comprehensive and effective missile defense. So that missile going up could be destroyed before it detonates, before it does damage. And the other is a hardening of the electrical grid and the systems we have in the United States, so it's not clear that everything, every plane, everything would be knocked out by an EMP attack.
Well, let's just take an analogy. An aircraft carrier, World War II. It had the capability of defending itself with anti-aircraft fighter protection, everything else. But what happens if the carrier gets hit? Then you go into damage control. So you're pointing out exactly. We need two things, which I hope this triggers this a little bit. We need ballistic missile defense, but we also need that damage control in place. The hardening of our infrastructure to be able to withstand. Because there's an interesting point you got to consider. If the systems are not hardened, would that not embolden some enemies to think that they can try this?
Exactly. And two things to point out. We all love the fact that we have Blackberries and iPods, that our cars are more computerized.
I don't like Blackberries.
Most people,
because your work follows you.
The point I'm trying to drive at is this, and this comes out in your novel, that we are developing a more sophisticated but more vulnerable society than we have ever had. Because as we have these technological achievements and they're more widespread, we become more, not less vulnerable. In your novel, there are a few cars that are working. They're all antique cars that don't rely on computer technology. You have a plane that works because it's an antique plane. Those hold up against this sort of attack in a way that does not happen with the highly sophisticated and fragile system that we're now building.
Imagine a graph. One line could represent the research going into increasing the gamma ray burst coming off of a nuclear weapon. That's classified information. I can't speak for it. I don't know about it. But one can assume that it's being done. Point two, which I think we're all familiar with. Think about a cell phone if you could afford one 30 years ago. You know, it's the size of a shoebox. Across the last 30 years, we have built a fabulous, wondrous, incredible infrastructure. But in so doing, we have become more and more reliant on micro-precision electronics that are ever increasingly susceptible to an EMP overload. Again, go back to Soviet Test 184 and you will read how it's reported that some of the ignition systems in the cars underneath this burst in Central Asia cooked off. We're talking a 1962 Soviet car, which I think was slightly overbuilt. Compare that to a vehicle today that's loaded with electronics. So we're seeing ever-increasing vulnerability at the same time that ever-increasing potential of damage from a small nuclear weapon.
You and I are aware of this. Some of the people in the room are. Most people probably in the country don't know a lot about it. An important point is that we are not alone in being aware of this as a dangerous weapon and as a weapon that could be used against us. There has been such a thing as an EMP commission that was established by Congress. Didn't get a whole lot of publicity.
You put that in the past tense as well. Exactly,
and there is some talk about reinstating the commission, but it's either out of business or going out of business right as we discuss this, if I'm correct. Particularly important to understand that, for example, the Iranian regime, which has as its rallying cry and has for 30 years, death to America, they know about EMP, as the Congressional EMP Commission found out. And if I'm correct, they have been working on, the Iranian regime, let me put it bluntly, has been working on developing the capability to launch an EMP attack. Is that correct?
Now you're really hitting into a core issue that is actually part of the book. There has been testing going on from barges in the Caspian Sea of doing a vertical launch and then declaring that it's a failure. There is only one profile that fits a vertical launch for use. This to me is the equivalent of, say you and I are out on a cruise and the water's off Japan in October of 1941, and we see torpedo planes doing slow, low-level passes in a narrow harbor. And one of us might say, you know, that looks like a gear up for a strike on Pearl Harbor.